Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 2 of the Peace and Power Ukraine podcast. This is a place where we're going to discuss all aspects of policy related to Ukraine and the many ways Ukraine sits at the crossroads of East and West, the crossroads of freedom and totalitarianism. Thank you for joining us. My name is Gary Marx. I'm your host, and our goal today with my guests is to really focus on bringing more light than heat. We want to dig deeply and have a conversation. We want to have a full policy conversation. So I'm proud to have Tim Goeglein. He is the Vice President of Government Affairs for Focus on the Family. He's also an author, most recently, of Stumbling Toward Utopia. So please grab that on Amazon or wherever you shop. And he's worked in the Senate, worked in the White House. I've known Tim for many years. He's recently returned from trips overseas in London and in France and Poland and all the way to Kyiv, Ukraine this last December. So it's great to have you here today, Tim.
Thank you, Gary. Great to be with you. A real honor.
Well, why don't you just unpack for us? I know that you are a historian and author. Unpack for us a little bit, when you did this most recent trip in December to Kyiv, tell us what you saw and understood really as an historian. Because for us, we want to dig deeply in our conversations. We want to start off in looking to the past before we can look to the future. So maybe what did you glean from that trip as a historian?
Well, as an American, it's always interesting to think about Ukraine because we read so much about Ukraine. We watch television, we listen and watch podcasts, but you can feel that you're familiar with this part of the world. And when you actually visit, you realize how remarkably complicated it is. And I think, Gary, the best way to answer your question, when I returned from Ukraine, a neighbor of mine here in Washington said, never having been to Ukraine, how do you think about it? She said, well, what is the metaphor? I love that question. And I said, in so much of life, you can take the proverbial knife and, take 2 or 3 slices in the apple, and there's the core and there are the seeds. And I said, now having been to that part of the world, first to Poland and then to Ukraine, and discussing the situation with Russia, I said to my neighbor, there's no apple, there's no core, there's no seeds. It's more like an onion, which is to say that you slice and slice and slice. You never get to the core. You just have another layer. And the longer that I was in the country and bringing history to bear upon, reading about Ukraine, reading about Russia, reading about Central and Eastern Europe, all of these years, I really thought again and again, this is complex. Not that other situations, countries, cultures, civilizations are not complex, but with the sheer advent of geography, history, culture, religion, certainly military, this has been, over against the history of the world, a very complicated, and that's the word that keeps coming back, a complicated connection with Ukraine and Russia. And you mentioned that I was also in France and England. That's all people want to talk about. They want to talk about Vice President Vance's recent speech from Munich. They want to speak about the maneuvering with President Trump and President Putin. They want to speak about President Zelensky and what the parliament will do or not do. That's not typical as an American when it comes to that part of the world.
Right. And they understand history very deeply. There's nothing lost on the Europeans when, last week there's a Munich security conference and there's negotiations about peace. And there's an understanding of what happened in that very place when it came to, selling out Czechoslovakia to the Hitler's regime. So all of that past history informs them in a way that maybe our American audience doesn't understand the layers of the onion.
World War II actually began on a day. It began on September 1st of 1939. And it began when Germany invaded Poland. When I was in Poland, in the trip that I'm sharing with you, we visited Auschwitz. And we were just past, and I've written about the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And when I was there going through what is now part of a museum, I met a woman who is a Holocaust survivor. And I mentioned to her the pending anniversary or marking of the 80th anniversary. And she told me that she had vivid memories through her family members of the invasion of Poland. And I expressed to her, this remarkable sense of how personal this was to her family. And she said to me in very broken English, essentially, she said, "You think that's big in our family?" She said, "Who would have thought that a mere 6 weeks later, that Russia would have invaded the other side of our country in Poland?" And that will stick with me forever, because Poland, like Ukraine, when you're in that part of the world, going back to where we began our great conversation, it's no longer turn the page in a history book or another documentary on television. It's lived experience. Hundreds of thousands of people just this go round have lost their lives. Thousands more casualties and injuries. You cannot find a single family in all of Ukraine who has not been directly impacted, touched, terrified by the impact of these past 3 years. And the point maybe I'm making inadequately is that you can meet lots of people and speak with lots of people. And for you and me, it's tell me about the last 3 years. But when you speak with the Ukrainians and people who are residents and natives, they can easily speak about the last 500 years. In other words, this seems to be the most recent chapter in this ongoing tension and almost impossibility, given their geography and the meaning of history.
Great points. It's great to be understanding from history than a lived experience where you were there on the ground, you met with Holocaust survivors, you met with families. And for all of them, it's not ethereal negotiations out there. It's real life, personal experiences. And they want to make sure that whatever peace is negotiated honors those victims,
Yes.
those that have been lost. And that's where the layers of the onion are so difficult. How do you explain to an American audience, who, hey, we just want this war over with. We just want this done. But it's not as personal for how complicated and difficult this is for the Ukrainian people. How do you bring that to life for them?
I love poetry, and there is a great poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, probably the most famous poem he ever wrote, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And there's a particular stanza, Gary, where there's a man on a boat, and he's in the middle of the ocean, and he looks around and he says, "Water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink." And this is in many ways the story of the part of the world that we are speaking about. It is an ethnic, it is a theological, it is a cultural tinderbox. And all of the discussion here in Washington, and you undoubtedly know this because of many of our own conversations about this, almost every conversation is rooted in getting us to, a temporary ceasefire or a moment of cessation of the fighting. And I say this with great humility. What I'm suggesting is that anybody who has read about, learned about, absorbed, been there, you realize very quickly that this is only the most recent chapter. And so I go and take a step backwards. And I think this is worth saying, especially, as we're dedicated to soft diplomacy. But I was in Washington working in the United States Senate. And I remember very vividly when President Clinton floated the idea of denuclearizing Ukraine. And without going into all of that as part of this discussion, but I remember in the United States Senate, meeting with people of goodwill from the State Department, people of goodwill from the Department of Defense, certainly from the Clinton administration. And I remember vividly them saying, if we can just denuclearize Ukraine and get an agreement, essentially we're home free. I mean, that I'm not overstating it. It was really that sense. We will finally address this issue of the organic historic tensions between Russia and Ukraine. And I'm not being naive. In real time, people of goodwill on both sides of the political aisle thought that made sense. Right. They really did.
And 30 years later, those seeds that were planted then gave birth to a full-scale invasion by Russia.
Absolutely right.
If they had had nuclear weapons to defend themselves, that would have never happened.
Right.
And I've heard that time and time again from Ukrainians. That was personal. That was their experience. They felt like the U.S. had to stand with them because it was the U.S. who said, hey, you need to give these nuclear weapons away.
Right.
One more personal experience that I'd love for you to share with our listeners before maybe we pivot towards the TikTok of politics and negotiations and press conferences maybe yesterday. But you were telling me off camera a little bit about a very personal experience you had at an orphanage in Ukraine, or maybe explain that to us and how Focus on the Family then moved and acted as a result of that experience.
Yeah, I would easily say that of all the time that I spent in Ukraine, that the one that made a most personal impact on me was one of the largest orphanages in the country of Ukraine. We're talking about an umbrella organization called Save Ukraine. And we began to meet children, essentially, who had been trafficked. We met with children who had been abducted. And the more we got into
abducted where?
Yeah, they had been abducted largely in one of the now 5 most hotly contested regions where Ukraine meets Russia. And I think it's fair to say that every member of our delegation, there was a kind of an odd hush that fell over the group because we like to think that we're well informed. But this was the first time, at least for most of us, that we were really learning about how Russia had systematically abducted young Ukrainians with the idea of separating them from their families and not effectively, but proactively propagandizing them into becoming new Russian citizens.
Wow.
And a few weeks ago in Washington, I was part of a luncheon group after the Ukraine visit. And sitting next to me was a young woman in her 20s. She and her brother were both abducted. Her brother remained under the not well-chosen, thumb of the Russians, and she was very eager to get her brother released and to bring him to Ukraine. And I think it's fair to say that you don't know where this kind of uncommon persistence and doggedness came, in the DNA of this young woman. And after the lunch finished, I asked her, just like we're having a conversation, where in your DNA is that rooted? And she said, after you have lost your mother, and after you have lost your father, and after you have lost the other members of your family, and after you have lost your community, and you know that you are only for sure one related, potentially to only one other person, it focuses your mind and heart. And I think Save Ukraine can probably replicate the kind of stories I'm sharing with you over and over again. If this is not a tragedy, I don't know what is. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the military deaths and injuries and casualties, as bad as those are. And it's not just the civilian deaths and casualties, but it is this other space of young Ukrainians who have been, against their will, abducted and are now essentially going through a very formalized reprogramming plan. One caveat that I think is very important: this young woman shared that a number of the young people who were in the same area of her brother who had been abducted, they were told over and again by their Russian captors that they had a choice, that they could live in Russia and have a life, or they would have to be returned to fascism. And the Russian propagandists went through point by point this made up concept of what living under fascism actually meant in Ukraine. And so as a man of faith, I mean, regardless of party or ideology or whatever, but as a man of faith, that is a very difficult worldview. And so I think it's important that people understand that places like Save Ukraine really fit their name. They are saving the next and rising generation of young Ukrainians who they are totally and completely innocent for everybody else's opinions on the war, but they're very innocent victims of what is being perpetrated.
I know that we're all hopeful that a peace will be established, but the wounds of war will continue for years on. And I'm glad to see Focus on the Family coming alongside Save Ukraine.
Thank you.
And supporting the healing process that begins for those families. So when we think about the peace that we all hope and pray is coming, the first step is going to be, we think President Zelensky may come next week and sign the minerals deal with President Trump and really build that economic partnership. It seems like that's a very real possibility. But then that next phase and more even difficult phase begins of true peace negotiations. I would hope that the children that have been abducted and taken from Ukraine to Russia would be part of that. A return of those 20,000 children would be part of that negotiation. I would guess that you would agree with me about the importance of that, bringing back families. Truly, we work with Focus on the Family.
Yes.
But what else needs to be understood, maybe from a moral and family component?
I think that's the most important thing that we're discussing, because I would imagine that many of my fellow Americans do not really understand how deeply important marriage, family, parenting, human life, religious liberty, conscience rights, parental rights are in the country of Ukraine. We met with most of the most important religious leaders in the country, and they are from a variety of faiths. Now, not overstating things, and to no one's surprise, the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians who are faithful believers, are some form of orthodoxy. And we met with a number of Orthodox leaders, but we also met with a number of Baptists. There's a large Baptist presence in Ukraine. We met with, of course, Catholics, Lutherans, Methodists, etc., Jews, Muslims. And the thing that you garner, as different as these religious leaders are, and they have very significant theological differences, but the thing that you realize is that the connecting tissue, of Ukraine is the centrality of the family. And if someone were to ask, who had never heard of the Ukraine-Russia war, but if someone were to ask just objectively, what do you think the biggest impact for ill has been in this war? I would say the dissolution of the family. I spoke with several mothers and fathers with young children there. They said that going to bomb shelters regularly is an absolute way of life. Many men whom I met who are married with young children said that they had made a family decision that the mother or wife and young children would simply leave the country. I was speaking with the head of Save Ukraine, the organization I mentioned and been speaking about a bit earlier, and I asked him kind of point blank, what has been the measurable impact on the nuclear family? And the only word he could summon, Gary, over and over was devastating.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult in Ukraine to get reliable empirical data because there's so much going on with the war. But I think it is very fair to say that the terrible impact on the typical marriage and typical family and parents, we will be dealing with this one way or the other for the next 100 years.
Right.
It really is that big.
Yeah, it's 3 years for the full-scale invasion's impact. But the country was already, since Crimea was attacked in 2014, dealing with some of the effects in a number of the regions.
Yes.
So in effect, the current conflagration has really been very hot for about 10 years and impacting families in some ways, taking them apart. So the rebuilding process, once we get to some sort of ceasefire and peace, really is the family. There's an economic rebuilding that has to happen as well. There are elections down the line. But all of these negotiations are underway and can go a number of different directions. But tell us more about your recent trip. You're at the ARC conference in London,
Correct.
I guess. What you were having reflected back to you from a European perspective, because it's no surprise the nature of the American-European relationship is changing. And how are they reacting? How are they understanding this vis-a-vis Ukraine in particular?
We arrived in Paris less than 48 hours after Vice President Vance had delivered his speech in Munich. And I think it is very fair to say that that may be the most memorable speech by any American vice president, perhaps in Europe, in the last 50 to 75 years or more. I feel very confident that Europeans, the rest of the world, of course, but European leaders, they will be speaking about Vice President Vance's Munich speech for decades and decades to come. They will be taking that speech sentence by sentence. And for those who are not familiar with it, he essentially said the greatest threat to Europe is not Russia and it is not China, that the biggest and greatest threat to Europe is Europe. A limiting of free speech, censoring free speech and movement and expression, the deleterious negative impacts of all of this within otherwise liberal democracies. The idea of the centrality of expressions of faith, the idea of being free, and what that actually means is supposed to be celebrated, in Europe. And especially, I think he was speaking about Western Europe, the place where America's greatest allies are, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, etc. And Vice President Vance sort of eviscerated this idea that this is the great bastion of free speech, free expression, religious liberty, conscience rights, parental rights. And he essentially said, no, there is a internal, very important threat to the way of life of Western Europeans. And what are the impact, measurables based on what he said relative to the American experience and our great alliance? I think it's undoubtedly true that NATO, I believe, is unbreakable. I do believe that. And I think we're having a new German chancellor who's very eager to say Europe must have a historic independence from the United States. But I think that in reality, I think Vice President Vance's speech put all of the state of things and the state of play on the table and made it very clear that in the new administration and in America's defense posture, security posture, diplomatic relations, both hard and soft diplomacy. He made it very clear that we need to have a new discussion about what this actually means. And I think it was and will continue to be something that is well worth speaking about and ultimately potentially negotiating about.
Well, I think it's fair to say that they would agree that the full-scale invasion in Ukraine maybe woke them up from their military slumber.
Yes.
Where they were just asleep with the confidence of NATO's past successes. And it has been incredibly successful over 80 years. But J.D. Vance was trying to wake them up to a different type of slumber about an internal malaise.
Yes.
And it may be one thing to have a ceasefire and have peace in Ukraine, but it's another thing that they won't have peace in their continent for long if they don't address some of those situations that he was pointing out. As we close out though, Tim, I really would like for you to just, share anything that's on your heart that maybe we didn't get to. I like to make sure all of our guests have that opportunity as we close out our conversation today.
Well, I think the most important thing to say is the place that we began. But I think it's important to say one thing more, and this is how I would express it, which is that the Trump-Vance administration, in my opinion, is an inflection point in the history of the United States. And I say with complete and total humility that because the United States of America is the most powerful country in the world, and I say that with humility, but because it is, and because, as they say, there's a new sheriff in town, I think it's very important that people worldwide understand that when it comes to President Trump and Vice President Vance, unlike a lot of the political class, that it's not just the next set of talking points, that it's not just sort of tickle the ears politics. I think that we are actually watching a tectonic shift in the priorities of the United States, both in foreign realms and domestically. And I think, Gary, that the implications for our country, culture, civilization, our relationships, in North America and abroad, I think that this is going to be the most substantial change, potentially, since the early and mid 20th centuries. And that's a big statement.
Wow. Well, powerfully said, Tim. We will leave it at that. And if you would like to hear more from Tim Goeglein, pick up his book, Stumbling Toward Utopia. That's all for today at the Peace and Power Podcast. I hope you will join us for our next episode and continue this great conversation.